Welcome back, my family. Before we jump into today's horror stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Your comments and likes really help YouTube push our video and show you even more stories. I'd also love to know, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Drop your answers and suggestions in the comments, and who knows, I might give you a shout out in the next video. Thank you for being here and for all your amazing support. The transplant wing of St. Jude's Hospital was David O'Connell's cathedral, and Dr. Alastair Finch was its high priest. At 24, David was only a medical student, but he had seen enough to recognize that Finch was operating on a different plane of medical existence. Finch didn't just save lives, he curated them. His hands, perpetually sheathed in pale blue nitrile, moved with a silent, terrifying certainty. His focus was always on creating the perfect human system, a chilling, clinical term he used to describe a patient who had received his specialized, often experimental grafts. David was captivated by the man's brilliance, willing to overlook the glacial emotional distance and the unnerving intensity in Finch's pale eyes. For weeks, David believed he was shadowing a genius destined for a Nobel Prize. The horror began not with a scream or a splatter of blood, but with a simple spreadsheet error that wasn't an error at all. David was tasked with cross-referencing patient outcome data for Finch's latest publication. It was during this tedious work that the pattern, subtle at first, began to solidify into something monstrous. Over the past year, Finch had completed 6 highly specialized, landmark transplants: kidneys, a pancreas, and 2 incredibly rare full hepatic swaps. All were deemed miraculous. Yet, David discovered that the donors for these miracle procedures were almost universally patients who had been admitted for routine, non-life-threatening operations under Finch's care: a gastric bypass, a minor hernia repair, an elective cosmetic adjustment. Their charts showed a sudden, rapid, and catastrophic decline within 72 hours of their initial successful surgery, paving the way for Finch's timely, heroic intervention to save the recipient using the newly deceased donor's perfectly viable organ. The statistics were impossible. Healthy patients simply didn't crash that fast and that often without cause. It suggested a terrifying calculation, an orchestration of life and death. David's stomach churned as he realized Finch wasn't just a surgeon. He was an architect of demise. Realizing the magnitude of his suspicion, David knew he couldn't go to the administration. Finch was too protected, too admired. He needed a peer, someone with the intellectual courage to face down a god in a surgical mask. He found her in Dr. Penelope Vance, a sharp, older cardiac surgeon known for her skepticism and blunt refusal to participate in hospital politics. David presented the anonymized data, carefully omitting the names and focusing only on the timeline and cause of death versus the initial prognosis. Penelope listened, her expression moving from weary annoyance to guarded curiosity. "David, people die. Complications happen," she stated, but her eyes were fixed on the columns. After 2 days, Penelope called him back to her office, the usual comforting scent of coffee now cut by a faint metallic sharpness. "The stats are impossible," she conceded, the words tight. The rate of systemic collapse in the post-op recovery stage for elective procedures in Finch's care is over 12 times the national average. He's not just benefiting from tragedy, he's manufacturing it. But how? The autopsies are all clean: cardiac event or pulmonary failure. Nothing is traceable. Their joint investigation moved into the realm of covert surveillance. Penelope, using her seniority, gained access to Finch's restricted research logs. The breakthrough came not in the sterile, high-tech labs, but in a decades-old pathology journal Finch had referenced. The journal detailed a forgotten, synthesized organic compound that, when administered in minuscule doses, cause a localized, progressive cellular breakdown in the liver or kidney, mimicking a natural, aggressive autoimmune disorder over several days. It was designed to be untraceable after 3 days due to its rapid metabolization. The compound, referred to only as Compound X7, was the invisible knife. Finch wasn't performing malpractice. He was performing preemptive murder to secure his perfect biological parts. That night, Finch admitted a new patient, Thomas Peterson, a fit, 45-year-old father who needed a simple gallbladder removal. Finch had flagged Thomas's chart, ideal hepatic function, candidate for future project. The phrase chilled David to the bone. They knew Thomas had the organ Finch coveted, and the planned surgery was scheduled for 7 a.m. They also knew the poisoning had already begun. The X7 would have been administered during his pre-op flush, Penelope whispered, clutching the annotated journal entry. It has a 10-hour incubation period before the failure becomes irreversible. That gives us until 5 a.m. They tried the formal route first. A panic call to the chief of staff was met with drowsy, annoyed dismissal. Dr. Finch's protocols are rigorous. Do not disrupt his patient care, Dr. Vance. Finch's influence was a monolithic wall. They were on their own. The hospital was a labyrinth of steel and polished marble, and Finch was its master. They had to intercept him before he administered the next, lethal dose, likely a booster shot to speed the inevitable collapse. They raced down to the surgical prep area, guided by David's knowledge of the student rota and Penelope's override access codes. The corridor was silent, fluorescent lights humming over stainless steel trays. They found Finch in the sterile prep room adjacent to Thomas Peterson's isolated bed. The door was ajar. Dr. Alastair Finch was wearing fresh scrubs, his mask down, smiling with an almost beatific expression at a small vial he held under the intense overhead lamp. He looked less like a doctor and more like a collector admiring a rare gem. Just a small supplement. Thomas, he murmured into the silence, his voice devoid of any genuine compassion. A necessary correction to accelerate the perfection. Penelope didn't hesitate. She burst through the door, shouting, "Finch, drop the vial." Finch turned, his eyes narrowing from scientist to predator. He didn't drop the vial. He pocketed it and moved with shocking speed toward the door, intending to escape and administer the dose elsewhere. David, despite his fear, blocked the exit. Finch shoved the younger man aside with brutal, unexpected force. Penelope, a woman half his size, tackled Finch low, bringing the surgical titan down with a thud that echoed in the empty corridor. The vial clattered, thankfully unbroken, across the polished floor. As Finch struggled, his composure finally dissolving into a furious, guttural snarl, David grabbed the vial and secured it, his hands shaking violently. "It's evidence, Penelope. We have it," he gasped, pinning Finch's arm against the cold tile. Finch's last words as orderlies finally arrived were aimed at Penelope. "You've ruined the curve, Vance. You've destroyed the architecture." The struggle was brief, brutal, and silent to the outside world. Thomas Peterson slept on, blissfully unaware that the man meant to save him was the same man who had engineered his death. Finch was taken into custody. David and Penelope stood over the sleeping patient, the captured vial of Compound X7 burning cold in David's hand. The organ architect was temporarily stopped, but the true work, exposing the systemic horror he had built within St. Jude's and ensuring Thomas's long-term survival, was only just beginning. A quick announcement here. If you're still here and enjoying these stories but haven't subscribed yet, please take a second to do so. Drop a comment too. It really helps push the video out to more people. Your support means everything, and it truly makes my day. The palliative comfort wing, tucked away on the highest floor of the grand, Gothic St. Clement's Hospital, wasn't morbid. It was eerily serene. Everything was pale beige and hush gray. The air always smelled faintly of lavender and ozone. Nurse Eleanor Brooks, 28, found the silence suffocating. She was a woman accustomed to the urgent beeps, the frantic whispers, and the raw emotion of acute care. But here, under the supervision of Dr. Helena Vance, the atmosphere was one of profound, unnatural tranquility. Dr. Vance, elegant and chillingly composed, was a pioneer in palliative medicine, revered for her ability to grant patients absolute peace in their final days. Eleanor, newly transferred, quickly learned the wing's unspoken reality. Vance didn't just ease suffering. She seemed to erase the person entirely. The patients were the focus of Eleanor's growing dread. They were not just pain-free, they were hope-free. They lay in their immaculate beds, eyes open but unfocused, responding to stimuli with the slightest, most measured nod, never an outburst, never a tear, never a smile. They were perfectly stable, perfectly compliant, and perfectly vacant. They were Vance's comfort collectors, and they made Eleanor's skin crawl. "We are managing the psychic landscape," Vance had explained in her cool, clinical voice during Eleanor's orientation. By removing the anticipation of pain and the equally cruel anticipation of futile hope, we stabilize the patient into a sustainable state of pure, tranquil existence. Vance referred to her procedures as advanced pain management, often involving minor, localized neurological interventions performed in her private, heavily secured surgical suite on the floor. The records were sparse, guarded, and always signed off by Vance herself. Eleanor, restless and morally disturbed, started her own quiet investigation. She reviewed the charts of the last 6 patients who had entered Vance's care alert and left, or remained, in this state of catatonia. She focused on the neurological workups. Every single one of them, regardless of their original terminal diagnosis, be it muscular atrophy or aggressive cancer, showed the exact same subtle, specific cluster of irreversible damage in the anterior cingulate cortex. It wasn't the kind of general degeneration expected from an illness. It was a targeted, surgical intervention, a precise trimming of the brain's emotional core. Vance wasn't just dulling pain. She was systematically removing the capacity for consciousness to mourn, to yearn, or to rebel. Eleanor was about to approach Dr. Arthur Reed, the chief of internal medicine, when Owen Davies was transferred to the wing. Owen was different. At 22, he was not only young but fighting a rare, slow-moving neural disease with fierce, unrelenting optimism. He was a writer, and his room was filled with notebooks and cheerful drawings. His presence was a vibrant, jarring contrast to the hushed beige tomb of the ward. He would often joke with Eleanor about his eventual recovery, his future plans, and the thrill of getting back to his typewriter. He was, in short, everything Vance's wing was designed to eliminate. Vance took a specific, predatory interest in Owen. "Such a volatile mind," she commented to Eleanor one morning, her lips barely moving. "All that needless energy devoted to fictional futures. It creates immense suffering. We must bring him peace." Owen's procedure, the final comfort session, was scheduled for Friday night, a time Vance preferred because of the minimal administrative and security presence. The night before the procedure, Eleanor found Owen deeply anxious. He wasn't in pain, but he was afraid of what Vance was going to do. "It's not the painkiller, Eleanor," he whispered, gripping her hand. "She talks about my spirit. like she's going to carve something out of me. I don't want to lose my fire. His genuine, palpable fear confirmed Eleanor's worst suspicions. Vance wasn't treating a symptom. She was silencing a soul. Eleanor knew an official complaint would fail. Vance was untouchable. Her work lauded in medical journals globally. Her procedures shrouded in proprietary secrecy. The security, led by the hulking and indifferent guard Robert, would never question her orders. She had to take the risk herself tonight. She began to plan an impromptu medical evacuation. She knew the pharmacy logs for the muscle relaxants and local anesthetics Vance used. She knew the shift change patterns. She knew the single and used service elevator at the far end of the wing. Her plan was agonizingly simple. Swap Owen's evening sedative for a powerful, fast-acting wake-up agent. Use her nurse's key to access his room during the quiet hour, and use the chaos of a staged minor fire alarm, a pulled lever in the linen closet, to bypass Robert and the magnetic locks. The biggest hurdle was Owen himself. He was weak from his illness and would need to be moved quickly and quietly. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Eleanor prepared her tools. A syringe with the stimulant, her key card, and a heavy, fireproof blanket to mask her movements. She found Robert engrossed in a novel near the main entrance, his presence a dead end. She moved down the corridor, the silence amplifying the frantic rhythm of her heart. She slipped into Owen's room. His vital monitors blinked with predictable monotony. She administered the stimulant into his foreline. Within minutes, Owen's eyes snapped open, clarity returning, followed by a surge of terror. "Eleanor? What? Chill. We're leaving now," she commanded softly. "Dr. Vance is not going to heal you. She's going to end you." Owen, fueled by sheer terror, nodded. He was too weak to walk unaided. She quickly swaddled him in the blanket, muffling his shape, making him look like a laundry delivery. As they reached the linen closet, Eleanor slammed her palm onto the fire alarm lever. The shrill, piercing electronic alarm tore through the peaceful quiet, making the entire floor flash with red emergency lights. Robert jumped up, fumbling for his radio. "Section D, smoke alarm activated." Eleanor, hauling Owen's weight, used the momentary distraction. She sped toward the service elevator. Robert, focused on the linen closet, initially missed them. But as Eleanor jammed her card into the elevator reader, Robert turned, his eyes catching the strange, hastily wrapped figure she was struggling to move. "Nurse Brooks, stop." "Who is that?" he bellowed, drawing closer. Eleanor didn't answer. The elevator doors began to slide open, an agonizingly slow process. Robert sprinted towards them. He reached the door just as Eleanor shoved Owen inside. Robert grabbed Eleanor's arm. "You're disrupting patient care. Vance's orders." "Vance is a killer." Eleanor spat, pulling free and stumbling inside the elevator just as the doors closed on Robert's frustrated face. The elevator descended, the deafening alarm bell still echoing above them. When they reached the ground floor, she knew they were exposed, but they were out of Vance's immediate control. They emerged into the quiet, lower receiving area, Eleanor's legs weak with relief. She called a trusted former colleague at a rival hospital, arranging for an emergency transfer and immediate full neurological assessment for Owen. The evidence, the pattern in the neurological scans and Vance's chillingly specific procedure logs, was still locked in the comfort wing, but Owen's escape was proof that a patient scheduled for absolute peace was fighting for his life. Within the hour, police and medical authorities, now unable to ignore the bizarre fire alarm incident and the disappearing patient, were swarming St. Clement's. Dr. Helena Vance, the comfort collector, was eventually exposed, not for malpractice, but for premeditated surgical murder. The realization that their own hospital's goddess of tranquility had been harvesting human consciousness was the true, enduring horror that would forever haunt the silent halls of St. Clement's. Agnes Miller, a single mother with a perpetually strained budget and a heart worn thin by endless work, saw the orthopedic surgery as a light at the end of a long, painful tunnel. Fixing her damaged knee meant she could finally return to her catering job without wincing through every shift. St. Basil's Hospital was gleaming and modern, and Dr. Julian Carver, her anesthesiologist, had a voice as smooth and reassuring as silk. He spoke of minimizing discomfort, of advanced pain protocols, and of a rapid recovery. "You'll be asleep before you finish counting," he'd promised with a confident, almost detached smile. Agnes took comfort in his clinical certainty. As the mask descended over her face, she began counting backward from 10, the smell of sterile air filling her lungs. She expected blackness. What she received was absolute, paralyzing terror. Agnes stopped counting at 6, not because she was asleep, but because the chemical embrace of the anesthetic had ceased. She felt the heavy, distant sensation of a large-bore needle entering the vein in her arm, but the accompanying rush of darkness never came. Instead, the world sharpened. She felt the pressure of the surgical straps across her chest and forehead. She registered the cold, clinical glare of the massive overhead lamp, even through her closed eyelids, which she realized she could not open. She tried to scream. She tried to thrash. She tried to even twitch a finger. Nothing moved. Her mind was a frantic prisoner inside a perfectly inert body. The drug that had paralyzed her muscles, likely a high dose of a non-depolarizing relaxant, was working with flawless efficiency, but the anesthetic had been deliberately replaced or simply never given. She was fully, painfully conscious. The operating room was a sensory assault. The clink of steel instruments being placed on a metal tray sounded like a bell tolling her doom. She could smell the iodine and the metallic, coppery scent of blood that she knew was her own. Then came the voice. Dr. Carver, leaning close, his voice lowered but chillingly clear, speaking not to his team, but to her. "You are awake, Agnes. You are experiencing what I call the ultimate feedback loop. Pain, Agnes, is the body's most honest signal, a spectacular bioelectrical event. Why dull it? Why interrupt the perfection of that signal? We require subjects who can fully integrate the healing process, not sleep through it." He confirmed her horrifying reality. She was his test subject, fully lucid, locked in a sensory cage, experiencing the trauma of the knee surgery without the slightest possibility of relief. She heard the faint, terrifying whir of the bone saw, the dull, sickening crunch of cartilage being manipulated, and then the searing, white-hot agony as the scalpel made the first deep incision. She felt everything, yet could communicate nothing. The operation was a lifetime of muffled screams and internal pleading. When it was finally over, she was not moved to general recovery, but to a private, isolated wing of the hospital's research unit, room 17, deep in the East Wing. Here, the immediate physical pain subsided slightly, replaced by a deep, throbbing ache and the suffocating despair of her psychological entrapment. Her body remained a sarcophagus of flesh. The paralyzing agent, Carver explained on his next chilling visit, was slow-acting and customized. She was now in the integration phase. Her eyes were now taped open, staring blankly at the ceiling, making her look precisely like a comatose or vegetative patient. Her only window to the outside world, her sole tether to humanity, was guard Robert Klein. Robert was a massive, stoic man in a worn blue uniform. hired to patrol and secure the high-value research wing. He had been assigned to the stationary duty outside room 17, often sitting on a folding chair by the door. Robert believed, as Carver had ensured all staff believed, that Agnes was a high-risk patient in an advanced paralytic coma, requiring constant monitoring. He saw her unblinking eyes and flat expression as a medical tragedy, not a signal of agonizing sentience. He was careful, kind, and meticulous, but utterly deaf to the silent terror screaming inside her. He would check her vitals, adjust her blanket, and occasionally read aloud from the pulp mystery novels he carried, the words a cruel mockery of her intellectual freedom. Agnes focused her entire will on the minute physical responses still under her control, the fine, subtle twitches of the orbicularis oculi muscle around her eye, and the tiny variations in her respiratory pattern, visible only as spikes on the attached monitor. She practiced obsessively, finding that she could control the speed and duration of her eyelid flicker, a microscopic signal that could be mistaken for random nerve spasm or environmental dust. But she needed a target, a moment of relaxed focus from Robert, and a clear, simple code. She observed Robert's routine. Every hour, on the half hour, he would stand, stretch, glance at her monitor for a full 15 seconds, and then turn slightly to look down the deserted corridor before returning to his seat. And every night, just before the 3 a.m. shift change, he would take off his heavy guard jacket, sigh deeply, and look briefly at the glossy photo of a small dog taped inside his locker door. That moment, that flicker of private, tender humanity, was her only chance. The code was simple. One fast flicker meant yes/conscious. 2 slow flickers meant help/danger. At 2:58 a.m. on the 4th night, Dr. Carver entered the room for his scheduled session, a detailed, disturbing monologue about the progress of her cellular healing, delivered directly to her paralyzed, open eyes. "The pain is subsiding, Agnes," he stated, tapping her knee cast. Proof that the body, when properly motivated by sensation, accelerates its own repair. Robert, standing outside, looked bored. When Carver left, Robert went through his routine: stretch, monitor check, corridor glance. Then the sigh. He turned to his locker, his back momentarily to the door, opened it, and gazed at the photo of his dog. As he did so, Agnes concentrated every erg of her being on her eye muscle. She heard the slight rustle of his jacket, felt the air shift as he turned back, and then he looked at her monitor. She executed the code: 2 slow flickers. Then a pause. Then she risked it again: 2 slow flickers. She couldn't tell if he saw it. Her heart rate, visible on the screen, spiked dangerously high. Robert blinked. He frowned, stepping closer to the monitor. He thought it was an artifact, a miscalibration. But as he leaned in, his tired eyes focused on the tiny, rapid, non-random spikes on the respiratory trace that Agnes had also learned to control. Then he looked at her eyes. He reached out a thick finger and gently waved it in front of her face. No response. Coma. But as he began to turn away, the slightest tremor, the 2 slow flickers, passed across her visible eye. It was agonizingly slow, deliberate, and entirely unnatural for a vegetative state. Robert froze, the magazine slipping from his hand. His face, usually a mask of professional boredom, dissolved into a raw mixture of fear and dawning comprehension. He saw not a patient in a coma, but a person screaming silently through the smallest, most desperate physical aperture. He saw the terror in her unblinking eyes. He didn't call the nurses. He didn't call the shift supervisor. He lunged for the emergency internal line, his hands trembling violently as he dialed the security director's direct number. "It's Klein, sir. Room 17. The patient, she's awake. She's been awake the whole time." Get medical and police here now. Get Dr. Carver out of the building. She's signaling for help. The sensory cage was broken, and the truth, raw and horrifying, was finally about to see the light. Ethan Davies, a medical student at the prestigious University of St. Bartholomew's, believed that sacrifice was the currency of success. He was driven, relentless, and utterly captivated by Dr. Victor Blackwood, the imposing silver-haired chief of surgical residency. Blackwood represented the pinnacle of medical power, a man who carved his legacy out of tissue and bone, demanding perfection from everyone who dared enter his orbit. When Blackwood summoned Ethan privately, offering him a secret, off-the-books research assignment, Ethan felt the adrenaline surge of validation. "This is where the real work happens, Davies," Blackwood had murmured, his voice conspiratorial, far from the noise of grant committees and bureaucracy. Only the most dedicated survive this pressure. The assignment took him to the sub-basement, Level Z. Access was granted via a fingerprint scanner hidden behind a janitor's closet on the hospital's main floor. The descent was immediate. The antiseptic air of the main hospital quickly replaced by a damp, metallic odor and the silence of deep concrete isolation. The lab was vast, low-ceilinged, and lit by buzzing, yellowing sodium lamps. It felt less like a medical facility and more like a decaying bunker. Ethan's initial task was simple: monitor cellular differentiation in hundreds of identical petri dishes. The tasks were repetitive, mind-numbing, and utterly without apparent purpose. But the environment wasn't what unnerved him. It was the staff. There were 6 other young individuals working down here, all wearing faded, generic blue scrubs, eyes glazed over with a frightening, medicated placidity. Blackwood referred to them dismissively as the research assistants. Ethan recognized their faces from photos hanging in the administrative hall. Former chief residents and star interns who had vanished from the main program years ago, their whereabouts vaguely explained as private research fellowships. They were the eternal interns. They moved with unnatural quiet, performing endless loops of meaningless labor, counting beads, sorting vials by color, charting data that bore no relation to medical science. One man, Henry Olson, spent 12 hours a day meticulously polishing the same 6 sterile steel trays. They never spoke, rarely ate, and only stopped when explicitly told to by Blackwood or the dedicated security officer. Guard Vincent Morrell, a hulking man with a perpetually bored expression, managed the ward's entrance and ensured the interns remained compliant, dispensing small cups of milky liquid, the vitamin supplement, at regular intervals. Ethan's suspicion curdled into certainty when he witnessed a brief moment of lucidity. He accidentally knocked over a stack of Henry Olson's polished trays. Henry didn't react with anger, only a brief, intense flicker of pure, unadulterated terror in his eyes before the placid mask snapped back into place. That night, Ethan used his access codes to cross-reference the batch numbers on the vitamin supplement bottles. It wasn't vitamins. It was a powerful, customized blend of tranquilizers and dissociatives designed to suppress executive function and emotional centers, keeping the subjects physically functional but psychologically broken and utterly compliant. Blackwood wasn't running a residency. He was running a psychological prison where highly skilled doctors were reduced to performing pointless servitude, an ultimate test of control and endurance. The trauma of the residency program had been weaponized and made permanent. Ethan's discovery had to be reported, but before he could leave the basement floor the following morning, Blackwood arrived. He stood in the doorway, blocking the path, his smile wide but cold. "Davies, you've been looking far too closely at the past," he said, gesturing toward the interns. You forget that research requires secrecy, commitment, and, above all, loyalty. You showed curiosity, Ethan, but you failed the loyalty test. Blackwood stepped aside, and guard Vincent Morel, who was usually a shadow, now stood rigidly in the corridor, a heavy magnetic keycard in his hand. The research needs one more dedicated pair of hands. Vincent, Blackwood instructed, his eyes never leaving Ethan. Ensure Davies is integrated immediately. The cleaning rota needs a new recruit. Blackwood had offered Vincent a promotion, command of his own private ward, in exchange for securing Ethan. Vincent, who craved authority and cash more than moral clarity, didn't hesitate. The heavy magnetic door to the service tunnel slammed shut, the thunk of the lock echoing the finality of a prison sentence. Ethan was trapped, locked down with the docile, broken doctors and the ruthlessly efficient guard. Ethan didn't panic. He understood the architecture of the sub-basement, having studied the blueprints on file. Blackwood's laboratory was a dead end, but the massive, crumbling concrete tunnels of the hospital's old HVAC system ran parallel to the north wall, leading eventually to a seldom-used utility exit near the loading docks. His immediate problem was guard Vincent and the drugged interns. Vincent was methodical but predictable. His patrols followed a clockwork schedule, checking the perimeter and the interns' activity every 30 minutes. The interns themselves were the key. They were compliant, but their actions were solely driven by the medication and Blackwood's simple, repetitive commands. They only reacted to the absence of their routine. Ethan waited until Vincent began his rounds near the far end of the lab. He then made his move. The most active intern, Cecilia Reed, was endlessly organizing a stack of empty glassware. Ethan, moving quickly and quietly, overturned the rolling cart next to her, scattering hundreds of plastic vials across the floor. The noise, though slight, caused a ripple of confusion in Cecilia's chemically dampened mind. Instead of continuing her task, she stopped, staring at the chaos. This immediate, non-compliant stoppage triggered Henry Olson, the polisher, whose job was contingent on the silent flow of work. When he saw Cecilia stop, he also stopped. Within minutes, the entire crew of eternal interns had ceased their meaningless tasks, their silence a profound disruption to the sub-basement's atmosphere. Vincent, hearing the abrupt cessation of activity, cursed and sprinted back. The disruption was his failure. As he frantically tried to restore order, shouting repetitive commands at the non-responsive interns, Ethan slipped into the adjacent, decaying utility tunnel. The tunnel was a claustrophobic maze of rust, dripping pipes, and dead electrical conduit. Ethan crawled through dust and filth, guided by the faint scent of diesel from the loading dock above. He was fueled by the horrifying vision of Henry Olson's terrified eyes. He had to expose Blackwood. After what felt like hours, Ethan reached the final ventilation shaft leading up to the utility exit. He was climbing a shaky metal ladder when he heard the heavy clomp of boots behind him. Vincent had deduced his escape route. "Blackwood promised me this floor, Davies." Vincent roared, shining a harsh, tactical light up the shaft. "Stop moving. You're going to join the others. It's easier that way." Ethan kicked out, striking the fragile metal housing of the old fan system just above Vincent's head. The fan housing, decades old, tore loose with a screech of rusty metal and a shower of sparks, plunging the tunnel into momentary darkness. Vincent yelled in pain and surprise as the heavy ductwork crashed down, blocking the main path. In the ensuing chaos, Ethan reached the top. He shoved his shoulder against the rusted emergency bar of the utility door. With a final, agonizing groan of protesting metal, the door burst open. Ethan stumbled out onto the loading dock, the cool night air of the main city a sudden, overwhelming blessing. He was battered, covered in grime, and shaking, but he was free. He ran, not toward the hospital entrance, but toward the nearest police precinct, the terrifying secret of Dr. Victor Blackwood and his horrifying permanent residency program finally revealed to the world. Michael Schmidt was a ghost in the gleaming halls of the prestigious St. Julian's Research Hospital. As a night shift cleaner, his domain was the silent world between midnight and dawn. The fluorescent-lit corridors, the empty labs, and the humming utility closets. He was meticulous, unnoticed, and keenly observant. To the elite medical staff, Michael was invisible. To Michael, they were all subjects in his private, nightly study of human chaos and order. He preferred the infectious disease research wing, Section C, run by the globally revered but fiercely private Dr. Vivian Krell. This wing, locked down behind 3 layers of security, was a fortress of sterile white and polished steel, and it was the source of Michael's growing dread. Dr. Krell was famous for her work on rare and aggressive autoimmune pathogens, yet her personal disposition was chillingly detached. She viewed sickness not as a tragedy, but as a complex, dynamic system to be studied, manipulated, and perfected. Krell's wing generated biohazard waste, carefully segregated and tagged, which Michael was responsible for packaging for incineration. It was this waste that first sounded the silent alarm in Michael's mind. Standard procedure required that medical waste related to treating a known disease, a cure, a vaccine trial, a massive antibiotic dose, should result in large quantities of inert pathogen waste mixed with medication traces. Krell's waste was the opposite. It contained small, carefully controlled, live samples of a uniquely virulent, genetically tailored strain, labeled only with internal codes. The waste wasn't the residue of treatment. It was the runoff of cultivation. Michael's suspicion solidified over weeks. He began noticing the staff, healthy young residents, robust nurses, and even administrative personnel who had spent brief periods near Krell's wing started developing rapid, inexplicable, and terminal autoimmune disorders. These weren't the long, slow cancers of the general ward. These were swift, perfectly targeted medical breakdowns, the body turning violently against itself, leaving doctors baffled and helpless. He saw the same specific codes appear on the disposal tags of Krell's pathogens as appeared on the medical files of the rapidly declining patients, including the young resident Arthur and the robust nurse Penelope. Krell, Michael realized with a nod of absolute horror, was not curing diseases. She was field testing perfect illnesses in a controlled, live environment, her own hospital. She was studying human panic and the collapse of the immune system when confronted by a unique, untraceable biological weapon. The horror became personal when his younger sister, Fiona, who worked as a general hospital nurse on the floor below Krell's wing, started experiencing uncharacteristic fatigue, followed by dizzying joint pain. Fiona was 24, vibrant, and normally indestructible. 2 days later, her pain spiked into acute, crippling agony, and she was admitted to the ICU, her condition rapidly deteriorating. The admitting doctor, utterly lost, labeled it a highly aggressive, idiopathic autoimmune syndrome. Michael, shaking with controlled fury, went to Fiona's bedside. Her charts, confusing and contradictory, confirmed his dread. The rate of her physical decline, the specific markers of cellular attack. It matched the pattern he had seen in Krell's other subjects. He knew, with a certainty that burned away all fear, that Fiona had been infected by one of Krell's intentionally released test strains. Krell had managed a breach, perhaps a minor venting error, or an intentional, undetectable aerosol release to observe the real-world transmissibility of her latest creation. Fiona, just an ordinary, hard-working nurse, was now a data point in Krell's horrifying research. The stakes had changed from ethical outrage to a fight for his sister's life. He could not go to the police. Krell's reputation and security protocols were too tight. He needed undeniable proof. Krell's personal research journals detailing the release schedule and the specific biological samples of the pathogens themselves. And he knew exactly where to get them and how to disappear while doing it. Michael's real home wasn't his tiny apartment. It was the hospital's sub-basement, the maintenance tunnels. For years, he had explored the labyrinth of rusted pipes, dead conduit, and concrete crawl spaces, charting every forgotten ladder and unused access hatch. He knew the building's skeleton better than the architect who designed it. That night, Michael began his mission. He dressed in heavy, unmarked work clothes, carried only a small, custom-made lock-picking kit, and a specialized, vacuum-sealed sample container. He bypassed the main floor and descended into the dark, sweltering arteries of the hospital. Moving through the tunnels, he reached a rarely used vertical shaft that, according to his improvised map, ran directly beneath the main floor of Krell's secured lab. The shaft fed into a massive, old-style air intake vent that Krell, in her arrogance, had simply covered with a layer of sheet metal instead of properly sealing. Using a precise set of tools, Michael peeled back the sheet metal, revealing a small gap. He knew Krell's office, where she kept her most sensitive data, was adjacent to the vent. He spent 30 nerve-wracking minutes carefully maneuvering a thin, specialized fiber-optic camera, a discarded piece of medical equipment he'd repaired, through the gap, scanning the office interior. He located the heavy, antique safe hidden behind a false bookcase and noted the precise configuration of the old mechanical lock. The next night, he was ready. He returned to the shaft, this time with a silent, high-power drill modified to drill through safe steel without excessive vibration. He spent 4 agonizing hours in the cramped, suffocating darkness, deafened by the roar of his own pounding heart, drilling the precise, necessary holes. Finally, the tumblers gave way with a faint, metallic groan. He slipped through the vent opening into the pristine, freezing cold of Krell's laboratory. The silence was overwhelming. He knew his time was limited. The patrol, led by guard Vincent Morel, would pass the main lab door in 6 minutes. He raced to the safe, pulled out the leather-bound journals, Krell's meticulous, handwritten account of her experiments, including the intentional aerosolization test that had likely infected Fiona, and snatched a few vials of the coded pathogen from a refrigerated sample shelf. He sealed them tightly in his container. As Michael turned to leave, a light flared in the main hallway. Vincent Morel, earlier than scheduled, was visible through the thick glass window, checking the main console. Michael froze, pressing himself flat against a steel workbench, the cold metal shocking his skin. Vincent paused, his gaze sweeping over the unnaturally clean room. Michael knew that if Vincent so much as glimpsed a misplaced shadow, he would be caught. Thinking fast, Michael smashed an unmarked bottle of distilled water on the floor behind the workbench. The sound was sharp and immediate. Vincent, hearing the noise, paused for a moment and then, deciding it was merely a pipe burst, a common occurrence in the older parts of the hospital, moved on, dismissing the sound as the usual nocturnal decay of the building. It was the cleaner's life, invisible, even when making noise. Michael didn't wait. He slipped back through the vent, pulling the sheet metal back into place with practiced ease. He scrambled through the tunnels, the heavy journals tucked securely into his bag, the vial of perfect illness against his chest. He emerged miles away at an exterior boiler room exit, far from the hospital's perimeter. He immediately placed an anonymous, untraceable call to the city health inspector and the regional press, detailing the exact location of the research wing, the name of the doctor, and mentioning the specific pathogen code contained within the vials he carried. He drove directly to a secure, independent lab, handing over the journals and samples, the final undeniable proof that Dr. Vivian Krell had turned St. Julian's Hospital into a lethal petri dish, and that his sister, Fiona, was one of her unwitting victims. Michael was no longer a ghost. He was the key witness, and his cleaning rota was done forever. Dr. Giselle Dubois had always respected Dr. Caleb Sterling. In the chaotic, high-pressure theater of trauma surgery, Sterling was a prodigy, a whirlwind of efficient movement and surgical genius. They had trained together, sharing the gruesome highs and soul-crushing lows that bind emergency physicians. But in the last 6 months, Sterling's brilliance had crystallized into something terrifying. The man who once shared a quiet drink after losing a patient, mourning the cost of their profession, was gone. In his place stood an automaton of flawless skill, utterly divorced from the human suffering on his table. Giselle realized he hadn't just mastered trauma. He had mastered himself by removing the very human element that made the profession agonizing. The change was most noticeable in the subtle details. During a complex thoracic repair, Sterling would issue commands in a flat, monotone voice, his face utterly blank. When a family member wept in the hallway, Sterling would walk past without the slightest hesitation, his gaze fixed on his notes. He viewed the body not as a life to be saved, but as a complex machine to be repaired. His efficiency was inhuman, and it was spreading. Giselle started observing a pattern. Certain doctors, those Sterling personally mentored and favored, would take a sudden, unexplained 3-day leave. When they returned, they were transformed. They had Sterling's surgical precision, but also his unsettling, placid demeanor, a quiet competence that felt deeply wrong. One of the most concerning examples was Nurse Emily Vance. Emily, once a warm, sarcastic nurse whose compassion was her defining trait, was now Sterling's shadow. She moved through the operating theater with eerie calmness, anticipating Sterling's every move, her eyes wide and unblinking. She was a perfectly optimized assistant, but Giselle felt a cold dread whenever Emily touched a patient. She was administering care without connection, treating flesh without regard for the spirit within. Giselle was committed to finding the source of this contagion of emotional apathy. She started checking the hospital's electronic access logs, focusing on the names of the doctors who had taken the mysterious leaves. The only common denominator was a single and used maintenance tunnel access code on sublevel 4, deep beneath the hospital's oldest wing, a level officially marked as decommissioned. Late one night, under the guise of an inventory check, Giselle descended into the dust-choked depths. She found the entry, a heavy steel door disguised as a utility panel. The lock required a specialized override key, but Giselle, using her knowledge of the hospital's security architecture, managed a bypass. Inside, she found a small, meticulously sterile surgical suite, clearly clandestine, fully equipped, and, worst of all, clearly recently used. On a stainless steel table, she found what appeared to be a detailed patient logbook. It wasn't a record of trauma care. It was a research journal, handwritten by Sterling, titled "The Cure for Compassion, Project Objectives and Implementation." Giselle's blood ran cold as she read. Sterling believed empathy was a cognitive defect, a surgical imperfection that compromised objective decision-making. His goal was to achieve pure, unadulterated surgical competence. The log detailed a radical two-stage procedure. First, a targeted, low-frequency electrical stimulation of the anterior cingulate cortex, the seat of complex social and emotional response, while the patient was fully sedated. Second, a continuous, low-dose chemical infusion designed to suppress specific neurotransmitters related to guilt, fear, and attachment. The procedure was non-lethal, but irreversible. He called the resulting mental state cognitive purity. The list of successful graduates was horrifying. Arthur, Penelope, and, chillingly, a full, detailed entry for Emily Vance. As Giselle scanned the latest entry, a sickening wave of recognition washed over her. The final line detailed the next subject, scheduled for integration tomorrow night, isolated from the hospital's main system. The name was her own, Dr. Giselle Dubois. Sterling hadn't just noticed her investigation. He had monitored it and decided her high moral resistance made her an ideal subject to study the procedure's efficacy. Giselle scrambled to leave, but the steel door slammed shut. Sterling was standing there, calm and terrifyingly composed, holding the bypass key. "Giselle, you're early for your pre-op screening," he said, his voice flat. "I knew your irrational attachment to this soul would lead you here. It is an emotional weakness I intend to permanently excise." Sterling overpowered her easily. He was larger, and she was already exhausted and terrified. He forced her into the inner surgical chamber and expertly strapped her wrists and ankles to the table. As her struggle subsided, he pressed a button, and the overhead lamps flared into blinding white light. "You're afraid," Sterling noted, observing the spiking heart monitor. "Fear is the final, pathetic act of the flawed, empathetic mind. We will correct this. You will be free of the burden of caring about the inevitable." A new presence entered the room, Nurse Emily Vance. She moved efficiently toward the sterile cart, pulling out a specialized helmet designed for cranial contact. Giselle realized with a fresh surge of panic that the paralyzing agent, administered by Sterling during their brief struggle, had taken effect. She could only move her eyes. "Emily," Sterling instructed, "prep the stimulating unit. Begin with a low-level frequency calibration." Emily nodded, her expression vacant. She reached for the electrocortex stimulator, the device that would begin to systematically erase Giselle's empathy. Giselle knew there was no time to wait for help. Her only chance was to pierce the emotional shell Sterling had built around Emily. Giselle focused all her energy, not on her physical restraints, but on Emily's eyes. She recalled a moment from years ago, a horrific case where a small child, a victim of a car accident, died on their table. Giselle and Emily had cried together in the break room afterwards, sharing the unbearable grief. Flicker, Giselle thought desperately. Flicker the memories, Emily. As Emily placed the heavy, wire-studded helmet over Giselle's head, Giselle focused her unblinking eyes on Emily's name tag, then up at her face, tried to convey a plea more profound than words. "Remember that little boy, Mark?" Giselle mouthed the words in her mind, wishing they could pass her lips. "Remember the guilt? The failure? Sterling says that feeling is poison. But it's the only thing that makes us doctors, Emily. It's what makes us human." Emily stopped. Her hand, resting on the calibration dial of the stimulator, began to tremble ever so slightly. Sterling was busy preparing the chemical infusion pump. His back momentarily turned. "Nurse Vance, status report." Sterling snapped, annoyed by the delay. Emily took a small, unsteady breath. Giselle saw it, a tiny, involuntary flinch of emotion, a hairline fracture in the cognitive purity. "Dr. Sterling," Emily said, her voice still flat, but now carrying a faint, almost imperceptible tremor. The cranial plate appears to be registering unusual neurological resistance. I suggest we recalibrate the input sequence. Sterling sighed, annoyed by the technicality. Fine, recalibrate. I want this done efficiently, Emily. He turned back to the infusion pump. It was the opening Giselle needed. Emily's hand, still resting on the dial, didn't turn up the power. Instead, with a sudden, jerky movement, she slammed her open palm down on the emergency shutoff button hidden beneath the main console. The entire unit instantly powered down with a heavy thud, and the fluorescent lights above flickered momentarily before dying, plunging the room into the dim red glow of the emergency system. Sterling spun around, furious. "Vance, what in God's name?" "I apologize, Doctor," Emily whispered, her voice cracking for the first time in months. The emotion was back, raw and painful, a torrent breaking through a dam. The resistance was too high. The data was flawed. She grabbed a heavy steel instrument tray from the cart and, with a scream born of repressed humanity, brought it down on the back of Sterling's head. Sterling collapsed instantly, unconscious. Emily stared at Giselle, tears welling in her eyes, the first tears in a long time. She fumbled with the restraints, her hands shaking, until Giselle was finally free. "I'm so sorry, Giselle," Emily choked out. I thought he was fixing us." Giselle, still struggling against the paralyzing agent, nodded, pulling Emily into a desperate, messy embrace. They had both been cured of the most terrifying illness of all, the absence of compassion. For Owen Davies, the recovery was a miracle. 6 weeks ago, he had been wheeled into St. Jude's Hospital with a terrifying diagnosis: a fast-growing, inoperable tumor pressing on his temporal lobe, giving him weeks, maybe months. But then came the specialist, Dr. Elias Thorne. Thorne, with his calming voice and unsettlingly serene gaze, promised a novel, non-invasive treatment involving advanced neuropharmacology administered during controlled, deep sleep. Owen remembered the treatment sessions as nothing but profoundly restful sleep, followed by beautiful, vivid dreams of hiking mountains, swimming in clear lakes, and waking up with a sense of boundless, physical energy. He was discharged 3 weeks early, his scans inexplicably clear, his mood euphoric. "The mind heals the body, Owen," Thorne had told him with a paternal smile. "You simply needed to be given the blueprint for perfect health." Owen was ecstatic, convinced he was a medical marvel. He ignored the slight tremor in his left hand and the occasional dizzy spell, attributing them to lingering stress. But Nurse Alice Carter, who had managed Owen's post-operative care and was deeply skeptical of Thorne's rapid-fire discharge rate, noticed everything. Alice was a practical, sharp-eyed nurse, and the narrative coming out of Thorne's neuro unit sounded like science fiction tailored for a PR campaign. Alice noticed that Thorne's discharged patients, always suffering from terminal or chronic conditions, all exhibited the same behavioral markers: extreme optimism, an almost religious belief in their full recovery, and a complete dismissal of any physical symptoms. Crucially, they all declined rapidly after discharge. They were sent home functionally, only to crash violently weeks later. Alice had managed Owen for 2 days before his discharge and had seen the pre-discharge scans. They hadn't been perfectly clear. They had been ambiguous, requiring further observation. Yet, Thorne had signed the release papers himself, overriding Dr. Peterson's concerns. Over the next 2 weeks, Alice began covertly checking on Owen. She volunteered for community follow-ups, presenting herself as a concerned former nurse. She found Owen in his apartment, meticulously cleaning, proudly boasting about running 5 miles that morning. But his gait was uneven, his eyes had a faint yellow tinge, and his left shoulder drooped noticeably. When Alice gently tested his reflexes, they were sluggish, dangerously so. The tumor hadn't been cured. Thorne had only cured Owen's perception of it. Alice's investigation deepened. She cross-referenced the unique, untraceable drug cocktail Thorne ordered exclusively for his dream therapy patients. The compounds were known to induce hypersuggestibility and vivid, reconstructive dreaming, but only when administered during deep REM sleep. Thorne wasn't healing them with pharmacology. He was using the drugs to make them deeply receptive to hypnotic suggestion. He was implanting perfect, false memories of wellness to suppress their physical symptoms and create a mental state of recovery, thus earning his miracle worker reputation and pushing his theory that consciousness could override biology. He discharged them in a state of clinical euphoria, knowing they would deteriorate outside the hospital scrutiny. Alice decided to confront Thorne directly. She found him in his glass-walled office, looking every bit the calm, genius physician. "Dr. Thorne, I need to talk about Owen Davies," Alice said. Try to keep the accusation out of her voice. "His liver functions are declining, and his neurological response is critical. The tumor is still growing." Thorne lowered his journal, his serene expression unbroken. "Nurse Carter, your concern is misplaced. Owen's mental state is the strongest indicator of his prognosis. He is entirely cured, believing himself to be. Any physiological markers you detect are merely the body's residual trauma, which the mind will soon eradicate. You didn't cure him. You gaslit him." Alice burst out. "You are administering powerful psychotropic drugs to implant false memories of health, so you can discharge terminal patients and protect your success rate." Thorne finally smiled, a cold, pitying expression. "You are displaying remarkable professional burnout, Alice. These are serious allegations. If you persist in trying to sabotage Owen's hard-won cognitive recovery with your negative obsession, I will be forced to report you to the nursing board for harassment and medical slander." The threat was clear. Alice was isolated. Her only option was to break the conditioning herself, but she couldn't rely on logic or words. Owen's mind was an impervious shield built by Thorne. She needed irrefutable, undeniable physical proof that would shock his conscious mind into recognizing the terrible truth of his body. Her target was Thorne's private imaging suite and server room, located beneath the neuro unit. The place where the before and after scans and the video logs of the therapy sessions were stored. The suite was protected by a heavy, electronically locked vault door. Alice waited until the changing of the night shift. She knew the routine of guard Arthur Miller, who managed the lower level access. Arthur always stopped for precisely 90 seconds at the vending machine just outside the neuro unit's main desk at 2:15 a.m. At 2:15 a.m., Alice was positioned near the vault door. As Arthur paused at the machine, Alice quickly slipped a magnetized shim into the card reader of the vault door, causing a brief error message. Arthur, distracted and annoyed by the vending machine jamming, didn't notice the flicker of the vault's security light. The shim didn't open the door. It simply held the electronic relay open long enough for her to work. She used a customized maintenance bypass tool, acquired from her brother who worked in IT, to manually override the locking pins. The process was slow, agonizingly loud in the silent corridor, and felt like an eternity. Finally, with a soft click, the vault door slid open a crack. Inside, the suite was dark save for the blinking lights of servers and diagnostic equipment. Alice moved quickly to Thorne's workstation. She managed to access the archived patient files. Under Owen Davies' file, she found a subsection labeled, chillingly, Blueprint Confirmation. It contained high-definition video files of Owen's therapy sessions. She quickly transferred the most damning evidence onto a portable drive. The video of Thorne leaning over the sleeping Owen, murmuring hypnotic suggestions like, "Your tumor is dissolving now. You feel the perfect blood flow. Your muscles are strong. You are entirely well. Remember only wellness." Alongside the video, she grabbed a raw, unaltered CT scan from the day before Owen's discharge. A scan that clearly showed the tumor, far from being dissolved, had grown by nearly 10%. As Alice finished, she heard the heavy thud of the main door closing, followed by footsteps. Arthur, having finished his vending machine snack, was now making his final security sweep. Alice barely had time to slide the vault door shut, but she couldn't relock it without triggering an immediate alarm. She darted into a narrow gap between the CT scanner and a supply cabinet, holding her breath as the main lights of the room snapped on. Arthur entered the suite, scanning the expensive equipment. He noticed a faint gap where the vault door hadn't fully sealed. He frowned, moved closer, and placed his hand on the cold steel. Click! He pushed the door, testing it. It slid back into place, locking automatically this time. Arthur shrugged, assuming a technician had been careless, and moved on. Alice stayed hidden for another 10 minutes before slipping out and racing out of the hospital. The small drive containing Owen's destruction and his only hope clutched in her hand. She drove straight to Owen's apartment, arriving just before dawn. She found him in the kitchen, making breakfast, his smile radiating forced, manic health. But as he reached for a coffee cup, his left hand seized in a painful tremor, knocking the cup to the floor. "It's just residual nerve irritation," Owen declared instantly, bending down to clean the spill, his eyes wide and fearful. The mind is still fighting the last battle. "Owen, stop," Alice said, her voice firm. She placed the portable drive into his laptop and maximized the unaltered CT scan. "Look at this. This is your body, not your mind. This is the scan from 2 weeks ago, before your discharge." The image of the aggressively modeled shadow on his brain filled the screen. Owen stared at it, the color draining from his face. "No, that's a mistake. Thorne showed me the new one. It was clear, perfectly clear." Alice hit play on video. The room was silent as Thorne's serene, hypnotic voice filled the kitchen. "Your muscles are strong. You are entirely well. Remember only wellness." The dissonance was a physical blow. The perfect, manufactured memories of health slammed head-on into the undeniable visual and auditory proof of the lie. The reality of the growing tumor, suppressed for weeks by Thorne's psychological cage, erupted into Owen's conscious mind. He stumbled back, hands flying to his head, the euphoric veneer shattering like glass. A wave of dizziness hit him, far worse than any previous spell. The pain in his shoulder, the fatigue he had dismissed, it was all real, terrifyingly real. "He made me dream it," Owen whispered, tears of horror finally tracking paths through the sweat on his face. "He killed me with a lie." Before they could plan their next move, Thorne's voice, calm and utterly ruthless, came through Owen's smart speaker. "I was afraid of this, Owen. You have compromised your cognitive blueprint by allowing negative input. I will need to correct the corruption immediately." Thorne, having noticed the brief security bypass in his vault, had remotely accessed Owen's home network, tracking his location and the video activity. The sound of a car braking sharply outside signaled that Thorne or his staff had arrived. Alice grabbed Owen, pulling him toward the back window. "He's not correcting it, Owen. He's coming to finish the job and bury the evidence. We need to go. Now." They scrambled out the window, the image of the tumor still glaring from the laptop screen. Their only hope, the undeniable proof Alice had stolen, and their shared, terrifying knowledge of the dream surgeon. Robert Klein's shift began at 11 p.m., the hour the rest of the vast St. Bartholomew's Hospital surrendered to silence. Robert, a guard with a decade of monotonous, graveyard shift experience, valued routine. His beat was the oldest, deepest part of the structure, the notorious Sublevel 5, officially known as the Legacy Ward. It was a forgotten place, rarely visited by anyone outside of Robert and its sole resident physician, the ancient Dr. Leopold Weir. The air down there was thick and damp, smelling of sterile disinfectant trying and failing to mask the scent of stale chemicals and old age. The Legacy Ward was dedicated to long-term, non-terminal observation, a euphemism for storing patients who had no family, no funds, and no clear path to recovery or release. They were medically complicated, socially disposable, and thus perfect subject for Dr. Weir's endless, cryptic research. Weir himself was a fixture, gaunt, stooped, and cloaked in a tweed jacket that seemed as old as the hospital itself. He never slept, never left the ward, and communicated only in terse, clinical murmurs. He had absolute control over his domain, and Robert's job was simply to ensure that domain remained undisturbed. Robert's routine was 3 rounds, midnight, 2 a.m., and 4 a.m. He checked the fire exits, logged the oxygen tank pressures, and signed a patient manifest. It was the manifest that first caused a sliver of ice to form in his stomach. The document was a single, laminated sheet, listing only 10 patients, each with a laminated photo, a name, and a decades-old medical ID number. On a Tuesday night, Robert noticed the picture next to the ID 74C98 had changed. The original photo, an old, faded black and white of a man named Arthur with thin, graying hair, was replaced by a crisp, full-color image of a young man with a thick beard and startled, gray eyes. The name remained Arthur. The listed diagnosis, a rare wasting disease documented in the 1970s, remained the same. Dr. Weir, Robert asked during his next round, holding the clipboard. Patient 74C, 98's photo was updated. Did he have a new portrait taken? Weir barely glanced up from his oscilloscope, his hands manipulating a tangle of ancient wires. The systems required an update. Robert, continual observation necessitates accurate records. Focus on your patrol. Robert moved on, but the chilling contradiction settled deep in his mind. The man in the bed, currently sedated and hooked up to a Baroque collection of ancient and modern machinery, was clearly no older than 35. The original patient, Arthur, would have been over 80. Weir wasn't updating the file. He was recycling the identity for a new subject. Over the following weeks, Robert doubled his vigilance. He began cross-referencing the patient IDs on the manifest with records on the hospital's main, accessible computer system. He discovered that every single ID number listed on the Legacy Ward manifest belonged to a patient who had been pronounced deceased, often decades ago, but whose medical charts were never officially closed by Weir. Weir was using the medical ghost of the old patient to hide the existence of a new one. The Legacy Ward wasn't a long-term care facility. It was a museum of medical tragedy, with living, breathing specimens slotted into historical display cases. Robert felt intense guilt for his role in maintaining this silence. He tried reaching out to Vivian, a night shift nurse who occasionally delivered highly specific, compounded drugs to the ward. Vivian, have you ever questioned what goes on down here? Robert asked her one night by the staff entrance. Vivian, already jittery from the isolation, just shook her head quickly. Weir's notes are meticulous, Robert. He's running a unique neurostasis study. We just deliver the formula. It's above our pay grade. Don't look too hard, Rob. You won't like what you find. The next week, Vivian was gone, transferred to the day shift maternity ward. A stark contrast and a clear warning to Robert. Isolated, Robert knew he had to find undeniable physical proof. He focused on the only part of the ward were kept locked with an additional padlock. A small, lead-line door labeled Historical Archive. Using a set of simple shims and a quiet patience honed by years of waiting, Robert finally slipped the padlock open during his 2 a.m. round. The air inside was freezing, preserved, and utterly silent. The room was not an archive of files, but a repository of biological oddities. Glass jars lined the shelves, containing preserved organs and strange specimens. But in the center stood a bank of custom-built cryostasis tubes, each containing a patient. Not dead, but suspended in a state of agonizing, non-degrading preservation. One tube held a woman, her eyes half open, her expression permanently fixed in a silent scream. Her ID tag read 22B40. Robert recognized the ID. It belonged to a patient named Eleanor who, according to the recycling manifest, was currently occupying bed 7. Robert realized the horror. Where wasn't just replacing patients when they died. He was keeping the most medically fascinating ones in cryogenic suspension, extending their suffering indefinitely. The legacy ward was merely the holding pen for the current, active experiments, while the archive was the doctor's prized collection of permanent specimens. Living, conscious, frozen proof of his obsession with the limits of human longevity and suffering. Robert looked at the preserved Eleanor and realized the man currently in bed 7, the new Eleanor, was destined for this fate eventually, once we're tired of his current observational cycle. Robert needed to document this. He pulled out his hospital-issued camera phone, meant for logging broken equipment, and began taking pictures of the archive, the patient IDs, and the horrific expressions of the preserved specimens. As the flash flickered, a heavy, scraping sound echoed from the corridor. Where was Early? He must have checked his surveillance feed and seen the archive's door ajar. Robert shoved the phone into his cargo pocket and slammed the archive door shut, snapping the padlock back in place just as we turned the corner. Trouble with the lock, Robert. Weir's voice was softer than usual, but sharper, like broken glass. No, doctor, Robert lied, his hands shaking slightly as he signed the final round of paperwork. Just checking the integrity. Damp down here can rust the mechanism. Weir's eyes fixed on Robert's. Integrity is essential, Robert, of the locks, of the records, and of the men tasked with protecting this facility. We're stepped closer, his breath smelling faintly of formalin. Your contract is valuable, Robert. Do not lose sight of your duty. The veiled threat was chillingly clear. Robert left the ward, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the hard drive of his phone. He had his proof, but the threat of exposure now hung heavy over him. The next night, Robert arrived ready to call the authorities. He had the photos, the patient manifests, and the archived records prepared to send to the local police and a trusted colleague in the hospital administration. But as he approached the legacy ward entrance, he saw an anomaly that froze his blood. 2 orderlies, not hospital staff, but massive, unidentified men, were wheeling a new gurney toward the lift. On the gurney lay a terrified, whimpering man, clearly recently subdued, his face bruised. This was the new Arthur, the latest victim to be slotted into a dead man's ID. Weir was expediting the process, perhaps feeling the heat of Robert's suspicion. Robert knew he couldn't wait for bureaucracy. He had to act. He burst into the ward just as the 2 massive orderlies were lifting the new victim, Arthur, onto the preparation table in the center of the main ward. Dr. Weir stood beside them, a large, antique syringe filled with a thick, opalescent liquid resting on a tray. "Halt!" Robert yelled, pulling his security-issued baton from his belt. "This is unauthorized procedure. Stand down," or didn't even flinch. "You are overstepping your authority, Robert. This is a clinical matter. We are simply beginning the induction for patient 74C98. You will retire to your station immediately." 74C98 died in 1993. "Doctor," Robert countered, his voice trembling but firm. He pointed the baton at Arthur, still struggling feebly on the table. "This man is a victim, not a patient. I have photos of your archive. I know what you keep in those freezers." We're finally showed a flicker of emotion. Not panic, but cold fury. "Fool! You lack the conceptual capacity to appreciate the value of this research. These are legacies, living tributes to the endurance of the human form." He gestured to the orderlies. "Secure him. He is contaminating the environment." The two orderlies advanced on Robert. Robert slammed his baton against the nearest patient's life support console. A cacophony of alarms immediately erupted throughout the silent ward, piercing the surgical quiet. He then activated his radio's distress signal, broadcasting the ward's location and the word "unauthorized abduction and torture" over the hospital's security channel. As the first orderly tackled him, Robert drove the handle of his baton into the orderly's solar plexus, momentarily dropping the giant. Robert seized the opportunity, sprinted to the preparation table, and grabbed Arthur. "Move!" Robert shouted, half carrying the still-drugged Arthur toward the main entrance. We're lunged, surprisingly fast, grabbing Robert's arm. "You will ruin everything. My legacy." Robert twisted away, the adrenaline giving him momentary strength, and shoved her backward. The ancient doctor stumbled, his head striking the corner of a heavy metallic equipment rack. He fell to the floor, instantly still, the ancient syringe clattering beside him. Robert dragged Arthur out of the ward, the high-pitched alarms still screaming behind them, echoing the tortured silence that had defined the legacy ward for so long. Sirens, distant but growing, were audible through the main shaft. Robert had shattered the routine, but he had saved one victim and exposed a collection of horrors that had been quietly preserved in the depths of St. Bartholomew's for decades. David O'Connell had always seen the future of medicine in the hum of servers and the glow of diagnostic screens. That was why he jumped at the chance to intern under Dr. Axel Krieger, the hospital's rock star of computational neurosurgery. Krieger was charismatic, brilliant, and utterly convinced that the human body was merely biological hardware, ready to be optimized or even transcended by digital means. For months, David was in awe, helping manage the cutting-edge equipment in Krieger's private, heavily secured neurocortex lab. Krieger's current obsession was his digital proxy project, an attempt to prove that conscious experience, including pain and pleasure, could be fully mapped, recorded, and edited in a virtual reality, VR environment. The ultimate goal, he claimed, was psychological therapy achieved through tailored digital experience. One rainy Tuesday night, David was authorized to replace a faulty drive in the lab's primary processing server, a massive, humming black tower isolated in its own chilled room. While running diagnostics, David found a hidden subdirectory labeled Project_Sentinel. It was highly encrypted, but David, a formidable amateur coder, saw the challenge. Using a low-priority diagnostic loop as a shield, he spent 3 hours cracking the key. What he found was not a data archive, but a live, streaming feed. It wasn't video. It was raw, real-time sensory data. It contained neural network activity, cardiac rhythms, and peripheral nerve inputs, all compressed into a single, terrifying stream of digital noise that ran on an endless loop. This stream represented a living consciousness, As David decompressed the stream, the data coalesced into horrifying patterns. The input showed intense, sustained spikes in the amygdala, fear, the insula, pain and disgust, and the autonomic nervous system, pure terror. This wasn't therapy. This was agonizing, continuous psychological torture. The source was listed only as proxy alpha. David's heart hammered against his ribs. He cross-referenced the unique biometric signature against the hospital's central EMR. The signature matched only one person, patient Thomas, a middle-aged man who had suffered a severe, debilitating stroke 6 weeks ago and was currently listed in the main hospital logs as being in a persistent vegetative state, comatose, stabilized, and awaiting long-term care placement. Krieger had taken a socially invisible patient, hooked his brain up to the system, and was subjecting his fully conscious mind to hell, all while his physical body lay silent and unmoving in a hidden room. He was using Thomas as the biological hardware for his digital experiment. David looked at the code he had just decrypted. The VR environment, as described in the metadata logs, was a continuous loop of sensory deprivation followed by sudden, hyper-realistic auditory and tactile assaults. The perfect, controlled environment to study the limits of human terror. David heard the hydraulic whir of the lab door unlocking. Krieger had arrived early. David snapped the laptop shut, forced the directory to minimize, and scrambled to finish replacing the faulty drive just as Krieger stepped into the server room. O'Connell. Good, you're still here, Krieger said, his voice clipped. He glanced at the server rack with a possessive air. I've decided to finalize Sentinel tonight. I need maximum server clearance. You can leave now. Finalize? David asked, trying to sound casual as he disconnected the cable. What does that entail, Doctor? Krieger gave a rare, chilling smile. The data acquisition is complete. The experiment has run its course. It's time to delete the simulation. We can't have residual data cluttering the pathways. Delete the simulation. David understood immediately. Krieger wasn't just ending the program. He was erasing Thomas's consciousness, leaving nothing but a truly vegetative shell behind, a final, lethal act of experimental disposal. Understood, Doctor, David said, forcing a nod. I'll file the maintenance report in the morning. He escaped the lab, his mind racing. He had, at most, an hour before Krieger initiated the final sequence. David retreated to the library's quiet corner, accessing the network from a secure terminal. He knew he couldn't just call the police. Thomas was officially comatose, and Krieger's high-tech operation was designed to look like a legitimate neuro-research unit. He needed the physical location of Thomas's body, the biological hardware, keeping the consciousness stream alive, and he needed it now. The location data wouldn't be in the live feed. It would be buried deep in the server's initial configuration files, the physical address of the secure, dedicated monitoring chamber. David knew he had to crack the final layer, the facility's proprietary backup encryption protocol. He reopened the Sentinel folder remotely. He found a heavily nested file path labeled hardware_deployment_log_v2. It was protected by an advanced, quantum-resistant encryption. David didn't have the time or the power to brute force it. He needed a shortcut. He remembered a minor architectural flaw Krieger had boasted about months ago to ensure the continuous, seamless sensory data transfer. The system had a fail-safe. If the primary system went down, a redundant log would be written to a temporary, unencrypted file located on a low-priority diagnostic partition. David quickly wrote a tiny, stealthy piece of code, a digital ghost, designed to simulate a controlled, localized system failure, forcing the server to write the temporary log. He executed the digital ghost. For a heart-stopping 30 seconds, the server room lights in the neurocortex lab flickered violently. David imagined Krieger's irritation. Then, the system stabilized and the ghost code sent David a message. Diagnostic log 001_10p txt created. David opened the temp file. Buried beneath hundreds of lines of useless sensor data was a single, plain-text GPS coordinate and a building name. The East Annex, Sublevel 3, Room D, 42. The East Annex was a disused, disconnected wing of the hospital, long rumored to be storage for obsolete equipment. He checked his watch. 45 minutes remaining. David ran. He bypassed the main lifts and took the dusty emergency stairs down to Sublevel 3. The East Annex was dark, its hallways lined with stacked gurneys and forgotten boxes. The air was cold, stale, and silent. He found Room D, 42. It was secured by an old-fashioned physical combination lock. He slammed his shoulder into the door, but it was steel reinforced. He looked around wildly. He needed a distraction, an intervention. Suddenly, a voice spoke from the shadows. Looking for the termination point, in turn, Dr. Krieger's head technician, Vincent, stepped into the faint emergency light. Vincent was a quiet, hulking man, fiercely loyal to Krieger. He held a length of metal pipe loosely in his hand. Krieger knew you'd get the coordinates. He instructed me to wait for you, Vincent said, his voice flat. He said you were suffering from acute moral contamination. He needs the system to stay clean. David didn't hesitate. He's about to murder Thomas, Vincent. He's going to delete his consciousness. Consciousness is data, O'Connell. Data is corrupted. I secure the hardware. Vincent lunged. David sidestepped the heavy swing of the pipe, spinning away and grabbing a rolling steel supply cart. He shoved it hard into Vincent's knees, sending the technician sprawling with a painful grunt. David didn't wait. He smashed the steel cart's handle against the key panel next to the door. The loud impact shorted the ancient wiring, overriding the combination lock. The magnetic seal failed with a sharp thwack. David burst into D, 42. The room was simple, chilled, silent, and dominated by a single, narrow bed. On the bed lay Thomas. He was pale, hooked up to a standard life support machine, but attached to his temples was a custom-made, fiber-optic neural interface helmet, the physical conduit to the terror in the VR. Next to the bed, a monitor displayed Thomas's real-time brain activity, a wild, chaotic pattern of extreme distress, mirroring the sensory stream David had seen on the server. The monitor blinked. Deletion protocol initiated. ETA, 2 minutes. David grabbed the emergency crash cart nearest the bed. He ripped the defibrillator paddles free and smashed one of them into the neurointerface helmet, severing the fiber optic lines with a blinding blue spark. The monitor instantly went black, the VR connection severed. Thomas's body arched, his heart rate spiking wildly. The sudden, brutal return from the sensory held back to the silence of his own body. Then, after a heart-stopping moment, his brain activity pattern changed. The chaotic spikes vanished, replaced by a slow, shallow, but calm wave. The mind was back in its cage, but the torturer was gone. The sound of footsteps and sirens echoed down the hallway. Vincent, though injured, had managed to call for backup, but David's digital signal was already in the hands of the authorities. David stood over Thomas, the sparking, ruined helmet in his hand. The silence was overwhelming, but it was a merciful silence. He had saved Thomas from the digital proxy, returning him to the flawed but human reality of his own body. The air around Dr. Dorian Gray was always crisp, charged with the nervous energy of impending discovery. Once, Dr. Penelope Vance had found that energy intoxicating. Dorian had been her mentor, a brilliant mind dedicated to pushing the boundaries of cardiothoracic science. Now it just felt toxic. He specialized in terminal care, yet his focus wasn't comfort. It was something colder, more obsessive, the moments before death. Penelope, a specialist in neurology, began noticing a pattern among the palliative patients under Dorian's care. They were all scheduled for an intense, highly confidential procedure Dorian termed bi-weekly systemic reset. While the patient's initial diseases were diverse, aggressive cancers, muscular dystrophy, systemic failure, their post-treatment symptoms were terrifyingly uniform. Profound, sudden-onset neurological trauma, localized to the parietal and temporal lobes, far exceeding what their primary condition should cause. She found herself staring at the latest charts for a patient named Edward Hayes. Edward, diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, was frail but lucid. After his third systemic reset, his medical profile showed a precipitous and temporary drop in core body temperature, massive spikes in lactic acid, and most damningly, a period of zero cardiac output. His heart had stopped. "Dorian, what did you do to Edward in that chamber?" Penelope asked, confronting him in a sterile hallway outside the restricted palliative research wing. Dorian, lean and impeccably dressed, turned slowly, his eyes bright with clinical fervor. "Penelope, I thought you, of all people, would appreciate the data. The human body is a fortress designed to repel death. But death is a key that unlocks the mind's final secrets. I simply forced the fortress to briefly open the gates." He wasn't performing experimental treatments. He was committing control murder. He was intentionally inducing cardiac arrest, a process medically known as near-death experience. Not to save the patient, but to record the neurological spike of pure terror that occurred precisely in the transition from life to clinical death before the mind degraded. He would revive them, keep them alive long enough for another reset, and catalog their suffering. Penelope's hands tightened on the folder containing Edward's horrifying EKG readings. "This is not science, Dorian. This is deliberate torture. You are killing them repeatedly. I am giving them meaning." Dorian hissed, stepping closer. "Their final moments are providing the critical data needed to understand consciousness beyond biology. Their sacrifice will be the foundation of a new era of cognitive resurrection." Penelope knew she couldn't rely on the hospital administration. Dorian's funding and reputation were too powerful. She needed an accomplice, a witness, someone who could confirm the horror and help secure evidence. She thought immediately of Nurse Emily Vance, a veteran caregiver often assigned to Dorian's unit. She found Emily in the staff lounge, calmly preparing a medication tray. "Emily, I need to talk to you about Dr. Gray's resets. I know what he's doing. He's stopping their hearts." Emily didn't even flinch. She capped a syringe and looked at Penelope with unsettling calm. "Yes, Dr. Vance. We know. The readings are incredible, aren't they? The gamma wave burst right before cellular degradation is profound. We are seeing things no one has ever seen." Penelope stared aghast. "You're complicit? You help him." "I help science, Penelope. These patients are terminal. They were going to die anyway. Dr. Gray is simply making their passing matter. We monitor them closely. The revival success rate is nearly 98%. We are pioneers standing on the precipice of true understanding. You should join us." Emily's loyalty wasn't born of fear, but of terrifying conviction. She was a true believer in Dorian's dark vision. The betrayal left Penelope reeling and completely isolated. Emily was the gatekeeper. With the nurse complicit, Penelope knew she was running out of time. Dorian had another systemic reset scheduled for that evening. Patient Lewis, an elderly man with end-stage COPD. Penelope knew the procedure took place in the revival chamber, a small, reinforced surgical suite that Dorian kept locked down. To infiltrate it, she needed to create a major diversion. She remembered a critical flaw in the old hospital's ventilation system near the chamber, a pressure valve that could be manually over-torqued. At 1 a.m., as the hospital slept, Penelope moved through the maintenance tunnels. She reached the valve, a rusted brass wheel, and applied steady, brutal pressure. The valve shrieked and seized, instantly diverting all pressure away from the research wing and triggering an auxiliary alarm that sounded like a catastrophic boiler failure. The sound was deafening. Guards and maintenance crews converged on the location, giving Penelope a window of perhaps 5 minutes. She raced back to the palliative research wing. The heavy steel door to the revival chamber was already ajar, a small crack of white light spilling out as Dorian and Emily, momentarily panicked by the diversion, were likely securing the inner mechanisms. Penelope slipped inside. The chamber was small, dominated by a surgical table where Lewis lay, already sedated and prepped with dozens of monitors running into a custom-built, bulky data acquisition array, DA, that sat beside the table. Dorian, dressed in scrubs, was adjusting the paddles of an advanced cardio stimulator. Emily was at the computer console, setting the precise timing for the chemical induction. Perfect, Dorian murmured, oblivious to Penelope's presence behind the oxygen tanks. Emily, begin the versed induction now. We need Lewis relaxed before the sequence. Stopping, Emily confirmed, typing the command. Penelope knew the versed was only the prelude. A massive dose of potassium chloride would follow, the chemical agent used to induce immediate cardiac arrest. She saw her chance. The DA, the device recording Lewis's final brain data, was connected to a power source and a series of fragile data ports. She moved silently, pulling a heavy, metallic tray of surgical instrument from a nearby counter. As she lifted it, the clatter of steel against steel was loud enough to make Emily whirl around. Intruder! Dorian, it's Penelope! Emily screamed, lunging for the main alarm switch. Dorian spun, his face contorted in a mask of surgical fury. You fool! You will corrupt the sample. Penelope ignored them both. She brought the surgical tray down with all her strength onto the delicate cable array connecting the DA to the patient. Wires snapped, monitors went dark, and the DA's central screen exploded in a shower of sparks. The chemical induction was already underway, but the data, Dorian's only goal, was gone. No! Dorian roared, abandoning the patient and lunging for Penelope, seizing her arm in a surprisingly strong grip. The data, the only truth. The truth is you're a monster, Dorian. Penelope shouted, wrenching free. The sound of rapid, heavy footsteps was now echoing down the hall. The alarm had worked. Emily, distraught, ran back to the console to try and stop the potassium chloride injection, but it was too late. Lewis's heart rate was plummeting, entering arrest. Dorian, now focused entirely on the ruined machine, grabbed a scalpel from the tray. You have destroyed my legacy. You will join them in the archives. Penelope used the chaos to her advantage. She seized the patient's portable monitor, which still contained Lewis's EKG data, showing the induced arrest and the intentional delay in revival. She needed to get out. Just as Dorian lunged, the heavy door burst open, and 2 security guards, followed by the anxious faces of the fire crew, flooded the room. Dorian was instantly restrained, screaming about his corrupted data and ruined research. Emily, paralyzed by shock and realization, was standing over the unconscious Lewis, unable to perform the necessary revival sequence. Penelope calmly pushed past the guards, handing the patient monitor to the fire crew captain. Induced cardiac arrest. Dr. Gray deliberately stopped his heart. He needs immediate revival. The records of the induction are on this screen. As the chaotic noise of emergency resuscitation filled the revival chamber, Penelope walked away, clutching the memory of the terrifying gamma wave spikes and the cold conviction in Emily's eyes. She had lost a friend and gained a terrifying understanding of how far the pursuit of knowledge could drive a mind into sociopathy. Dorian Gray's reign of terror, built on the suffering of those he swore to protect, was over thanks to a shriek from a rusted pipe and a desperate smash of a surgical tray.